Good evening, everyone. Welcome to week number 4, if you can believe that. It actually is week number 4 for PPA 660. So after tonight's class, we have two more Tuesday night sessions next week and the week after that. So we are speeding through our 6 weeks very, very quickly. The summer always seems to fly by and you blink and it's fall semester again. So we are moving through this relatively quickly, but what we have on our agenda for tonight is last week we talked about the classical school, and I think we handled that, and so that kind of creates this foundational frame of reference to then move ahead and start talking about some of the neoclassical schools of organization theory. So tonight we will start a discussion of the neoclassical schools. We will look at the school of human relations. We'll also look at the school of human resource management. And then we'll also talk about motivational theories because where the literature went from human resource management, once the human resource management theorists recognized the importance of getting compliance from employees, then the literature kind of then moved into the question of, well, how do we motivate those employees to provide that compliance and to provide their best efforts to lead to higher levels of productivity? So it's kind of a natural segue to go from human resource management into motivational theories. So those are the three major, if you want to call them, schools that we will talk about tonight: human relations, human resource management, and then motivational theories. We'll cover all that information tonight. It is a good bit of information. If you've had a chance to take a look at the slides yet, don't be concerned with the fact that the motivational slides, I think there are maybe over 40 of them. We're not going to go through every single element on those slides, but what we will do is we will go through information on what those motivational theories are. We will classify them into content versus process-based theories and introduce you to or reintroduce you to about 8 or 9 different theorists who have really focused on how we can enhance the motivational levels of our employees. And I think that that will then take us through the course of tonight's session. Then for next week, we will move into systems theory. We'll also talk about some of the quote unquote more modern organization theories. So we'll also talk about things like participative management, quality management. We will talk about organization culture and leadership theories. And then that will actually round out all of the information we typically cover in 660, even though we've done on a very accelerated type of schedule. And then we'll be ready for those presentations of your organizational analysis papers. Now, the vast majority of our presentations will occur in our final Zoom session together, so 2 weeks from tonight. But if there's anyone who is interested in doing their presentation in next week's session, feel free to send me an email and let me know that, because if we could get maybe just a handful, maybe 3 or 4 presentations on our agenda for the latter part of class next week, then that will then clear the decks to then do all the remaining presentations then in our final class session together. And if you are thinking about maybe volunteering to do your presentation next week, just as a reminder, those presentations are very brief. They're 5 to 10 minutes max, with the preference hopefully being closer to 5 minutes, just so we can get through all of them. The very informal presentations, and all that you are doing in your presentation is you're just basically in an informal way, just kind of walking us through your organizational analysis paper. So giving us an idea of what models of organizational effectiveness are being used in your organization, what methods for coordination and control of work, what motivational strategies, what types of classical theories you saw in your organization, what types of neoclassical theories, what type of system the organization operates in, just kind of through those different elements of your paper. And again, you can do it very, very quickly. 5 to 10 minutes will certainly get the job done. You can use PowerPoint slides, certainly, if you would like. You don't have to get those slides pre-screened by me, because I will enable screen sharing for our session when we're doing the presentations. So you'll be able to just kind of share your screen directly from your own computer. And so you don't have to get them pre-screened by me. You don't have to use PowerPoint slides if you don't want to. It's completely up to you and whatever kind of works for your style of presenting. If you feel better just kind of doing it the way you've always done it without slides and without an agenda, that's fine with me too. But again, don't spend too much time worrying about the presentation. It is very brief and it is very informal. But if anyone is thinking about maybe doing their presentation next week, just shoot me an email and we'll be sure to get you on the agenda. If there's no one who wants to volunteer for next week, we can also survive that as well. I think we have a total of 18 people in the class this term. So if we can keep our presentations about under 10 minutes each and maybe closer to about 5 to 7 minutes, we would still have enough time in that final session to get through all of our presentations. So I leave it up to you whether or not you want to volunteer to do a presentation 1 week early. But that's where we are, and that's where we are going over the next 2 weeks. Then your organizational analysis paper will then be due, and then also you have the final assessment. Remember that final assessment is very brief. All you are doing there is just essentially answering those 3 questions about Cal State Long Beach. So question number 1, what types of classical organization theories do you see at Cal State Long Beach? You can do that in a paragraph or 2. Question 2, what neoclassical theories, primarily human relations and human resource management, do you see at Cal State Long Beach? Again, a paragraph or 2. And then the third question, what type of system do you think that Cal State Long Beach operates in? And then, again, a paragraph or 2, and just some brief examples for each one of those 3 questions. So it doesn't have to be very long. It can be something that, again, you're just illustrating your ability to take these theories and apply them to the one organization that we all share in common as students and faculty and staff members, and that's Cal State Long Beach. So I think that kind of catches us up to where we are and then where we're going over the next 2 weeks. Thank you for your last Canvas essays. All those that came in by about 4:30 today, I've taken a look at and I've provided feedback on. Please do remember, in addition to your initial post, do remember to reply to 2 of your classmates, because the entire Canvas essay for the week is worth 20 points, 10 points attributable to your initial post, and then 5 points attributed to each one of your 2 responses to classmates. Your next one that's coming up, I believe, is Canvas essay number 4, which is then coming due next week. And that Canvas essay will draw upon what we talked about tonight in terms of human relations and human resource management theory, and people like Mary Parker Follett and Douglas McGregor. So that is then due next week. Okay. Any questions or anything at all about our schedule, where we are, where we're going before we get into our neoclassical schools? Okay. Then let's go ahead and jump into it with our neoclassical schools. And some of these people you were introduced to, I'm sure, in PPA 500. If you had the misfortune of having me as your instructor for 500, I know you've been introduced to many of these people before, but we did it at a very cursory, very superficial level in 500 just because of the nature of the course. Here, we're going to delve into each one of these neoclassical theories in a little bit more detail. And where we usually start with our neoclassical schools of thought is usually going to be with Mary Parker Follett. Because one of the reasons why we had the development of those neoclassical schools of organization theory was because of all of the problems and the criticisms we talked about last week with classic organization theory. And so the hope of these neoclassical theories is that we could remedy some of those classical problems. And some of those problems were clearly the flaws of scientific management. And last week, we talked about scientific management. Many of you shared some of the problems with scientific management, such as it was dehumanizing, really didn't place any value on individual employees, didn't really focus on motivating our employees, and it was a very top-down, centralized, exploitative way in which to structure the work in our organizations. So recognizing that, we have people like Mary Parker Follett. And if you have me for 500, you know that she's one of my favorite authors. Mary Parker Follett, who really starts to focus attention on some of these fatal flaws associated with scientific management. And Tompkins deals with Mary Parker Follett separately from other human relations theorists. And he does that primarily for the reason of chronology. Mary Parker Follett was writing well before the other human relations theorists. So we have Mary Parker Follett writing in the early 1900s and the 1920s at the very heyday of scientific management. So at the very time that all these private and then later public organizations were adopting the principles of scientific management, you had Mary Parker Follett coming along and saying, we need to stop for a second and understand that there are all these problems that are associated with scientific management and Taylorism. So that's one of the reasons why I'm such a big fan of Mary Parker Follett, is that she was one of the first people to actually stand up and take issue with the classical theories. I always refer to her, if you remember from 500, as this lone voice in the wilderness. And so, since she was such a pioneer, she really came before the other human relations theorists. And that's why Tompkins refers to her as a pre-human relations theorist, just because of chronology. But also, he refers to her as a pre-human relations theorist because she was writing in the 1920s, and her writings were, when people did read them, were somewhat unpopular because they were finding flaws in a very popular management school. But a lot of people didn't know of her writings, especially people like Elton Mayo and Fritz Roethlisberger and Hertzberg and all these other human relations theorists. They were not familiar with Mary Parker Follett, although their theories mirror very closely the theories that Follett was developing 10, 20, and 30 years before they were actually doing their writing. So that's kind of why she's considered this pre-human relations theorist. She's a really nice bridge for us between the classical school and neoclassical schools of organization theory. I also, as you know, like Mary Parker Follett a lot because she focuses on the idea of democracy. And she talks about our organizations as being democratic organizations. And she likens an organization to a political culture and to a political society. And so she says the most advantageous way for us to organize and run our organizations is if we view them as essentially democratic societies. They're kind of mini democratic societies, what she calls democratic organizations. She was a big believer in representative democracy. However, she recognized that there were some fundamental flaws associated with the representative democracy as well. And those two fundamental flaws that she illustrated for us: particularized interest and passivity of citizens. So that first flaw of a representative democracy is particularized interest. This harkens back to James Madison, who you read in your PPA 500 course, and his writings in Federalist Paper number 10, where he talks about factions and the need to try and control the effects of factions. Madison talked to us about having a compound republic, that he viewed the most effective way to organize the government is through this compound type of arrangement, whereby we have a large jurisdiction that is filled with a lot of different people and groups, and a lot of different people and groups who all have different opinions and different vested interests. That was his compound republic. That compound republic, as you'll probably remember, was the counterbalance to the prevailing philosophy at the time from Montesquieu and others, which was for a compact republic. So the prevailing wisdom was, in order to put a government together, you would have to have a compact republic whereby you had a small jurisdiction that was filled with individuals and groups that all shared very similar opinions and very similar thoughts and vested interests. You need to have a whole lot of homogeneity in terms of your population in a compact republic. Madison argued for a compound republic where we have a lot of heterogeneity among our population. But the downside of the compound republic, as you know from Federalist 10, if you remember that, is the emergence of these factions. They are going to have these factions that will emerge. These factions are all groups with particularized interests, which is the same type of thing that Mary Parker Follett was talking about. So she said the representative democracies in a compound republic are going to spawn these particularized interests. Obviously, when you have particularized interests, you are going to have interests coming into conflict with each other. Hence, conflict is a natural part of a compound republic. So if we're going to have a democratic organization that allows our employees to participate in their own governance, then you're going to have conflict between all these different particularized interests. However, the second flaw that she saw in a representative democracy is passivity on the part of citizens. That citizens may have all these different avenues for participation. It's what Morton Grodzins refers to as his multiple crack theory. When you look at our theory of deliberative democracy, we have all these multiple cracks that afford people the opportunity to participate in their own governance, whether it be by voting or campaigning for a candidate, belonging to a political party, donating to a party or to a candidate, lobbying Congress, writing letters to your representatives, whatever the case may be, running for office. You've got all these different multiple cracks you can exploit in order to participate in your own governance. However, in a representative democracy, the problem is people typically take the most passive route. So, by far, the most common way in which people participate is through voting. Voting is a very low intensity, very low cost and effort type of endeavor, especially here in a state like California, where, at least still for now, we use mail ballots. And so everyone receives a ballot. You don't have to ask for an absentee ballot, and everyone has the ability to vote from home. They can, drop their vote off in the mail, at least as of now. They can drop their votes off in a vote box, a ballot box. They can go and drop them off in a vote center. And you don't have to actually go and stand in line and vote on election day. That is by far the most popular way of voting here in California. And in recent elections, we have seen upwards of 80% of the votes being cast are not cast at a ballot center on voting day. That we see people voting early because of all these different methods for voting. So it's very easy to vote. And so that's a very passive way in which you participate. She found that that's a flaw in a representative democracy because if people are only participating through voting, they are not very involved in the process. They don't feel like they have a very lot of buy-in. They don't have a lot of what we call efficacy. And if you're familiar with the voting literature in the world of political science, people are more likely to trust their government. They're more likely to be involved when they have what's called high levels of internal and external efficacy. Internal efficacy is a feeling that you can understand democracy and you can understand the types of things that you would be making decisions about. External efficacy is a feeling that your participation makes a difference. If you do not feel you understand the issues and you have low internal efficacy, and you also feel that your vote is not making a difference or your participation at a city council meeting won't make a difference, then you have low feelings of external efficacy and you're also going to be less likely to participate. So people tend to be very passive in their participation in a democracy. And it's the same type of thing in a democratic organization, that people tend to be very passive. They go in there, they do their jobs, they try and do what they need to do in order to get their paycheck, and they then go home. They don't feel very affiliated with the organization. They don't feel that what they are doing and their ideas and opinions have any sway or any impact upon the organization. They're just not terribly connected. They're very passive. So she argues in a democratic organization, just like in a democratic society, our employees are going to suffer from these two fundamental flaws that our citizens also suffer from. So her theories were really based upon the question of how can an organization rectify those fundamental flaws of particularized interest and passivity on the part of citizens. Her answer to that is that democratic organizations need to encourage and foster employee participation. Now, in the classical theories, we were not really caring all that much about people participating in the organization beyond just what they were doing on a daily basis and if they're doing the job in the one best way. Now we are concerned with that because we want people to participate in their own governance, but recognizing that when we foster participation, these folks will have different particularized interests. It means particularized interest is going to come into conflict with other particularized interests, which means it heightens the likelihood of conflict in our organizations. So she said, if we are going to foster participation, we need to have ways in which we can deal with conflict. And let's see, we see it in text chat. Mohammed is saying Princeton study concluded preferences of average ordinary Americans have almost zero impact on public policy. Other times citizens get what they want is when their preferences happen to align with economic elite. We do have a good discussion in political science and have had a good discussion in political science over the past several decades about, are we a pluralistic society or are we an elitist society or are we a bureaucratic technocratic society? A pluralistic society is one in which people can participate and actually have impact upon decisions and resulting public policies. That is very similar to the work of Robert Dahl out of Yale University in his very famous study of New Haven, Connecticut, where he argued that decision-making in New Haven, Connecticut was very much pluralistic in nature, and that anyone who wanted to participate had the opportunity to participate, and their participation could have an impact upon policy. That was then countered about a decade and a half later by Floyd Hunter, who did a very famous study of power in Atlanta, Georgia. His conclusion was that decision-making in Atlanta, Georgia was far more elitist in nature, in that he identified a cadre of elite decision makers that cut across the government world, the corporate world, and it was those elite decision makers, that one cadre of decision makers, who had the most impact upon policy and decisions being made in Atlanta, Georgia. So that's your elitist type of idea. Then the technocratic idea is that the real power over the substance of public policies is really coming from the bureaucrats, those who are actually implementing the policies. I think that the answer, as with most things, is it really is a combination of all of those taken together. I think it is very Pollyanna-ish of us to think that we are a pluralistic society. It's hard to say, a purely pluralistic society. Because if you look at the amount of money that's flowing into campaigns, the dark money that comes into campaigns from super PACs and all these independent expenditures, it's kind of hard to say that that is going to be an equivalent amount of power as what one average ordinary citizen would have. Emma says, watch a group of 20 people speak at a Long Beach City Council meeting and see the impact it makes, shifts conversation, decision-making entirely. And I agree with that, Emma. I'm having served on that school board for several years, and having served on the school board during COVID, I have seen that. When you have groups of citizens and groups of parents who come in and speak on an issue, they can actually get some movement on the part of the school board, similar way in which you can get movement on the part of those city council members. I think that that type of pluralism is oftentimes much more likely to happen at the local level than perhaps what you would see at the national level with Congress. At Congress, you see much more of an impact from these lobbyists and these moneyed interests. But I really do think it's kind of a combination of all three of those different types of models. But it depends. My favorite answer is it depends. It depends upon the level of government in which people are trying to effect change with their participation. But this participation naturally, and this is something that Madison agreed with, is naturally this participation is going to lead to conflict. And so what Madison told us in Federalist number 10 is we cannot eliminate factions because eliminating factions would be equivalent to eliminating representative deliberative democracy. But instead, what we need to do is to control the effects of those factions. Well, here Mary Parker Follett agrees in that, yes, we have to try and control conflict. She presents to us three different models that we could use to try and deal with and control conflict: domination, compromise, and integration. And they are listed there from what she would say is the least favorable to the most favorable. So the least favorable way to deal with conflict is domination. One party wins, one party loses. It's very much of a zero-sum game. One group or one interest gains in influence and power at the detriment of another group or another interest. She says that's obviously the worst way to deal with conflict, because when you deal with conflict in that manner, there's always going to be someone or one group that is going to be very dissatisfied and disaffected. So if your group is being dominated by another group, you're obviously not going to be very happy with the decisions that are being made by the winning group. So you're always going to ensure that some members of your organization are going to be dissatisfied. So the second way to deal with conflict is through negotiation and compromise. That is better than domination, but it is still not the most appropriate way to deal with conflict. Because even when you have a negotiated compromise, you still have both parties giving something up. So party A and party B will both give something up in order to come to this negotiated settlement. So both parties, even though they won't be completely dissatisfied, will still be somewhat dissatisfied with the conclusion. The most appropriate, we try and avoid using the word best when we're talking organization theories, because as we talked about over the last couple of weeks, there is no one best approach in organization theory. It is the approach that is most appropriate in that given situation. So the most appropriate approach, according to Follett, is integration. So if we allow for participation on the part of all these members of our organization, as they participate in decision making, they share ideas with each other. As those ideas get shared, those ideas then interpenetrate, what she calls the interpenetration of ideas. So person A's ideas will interpenetrate into the thought process of person B, and so on and so on. And then through that interpenetration of ideas, we then have what she calls integration. Integration is taking all these interpenetrated ideas and using them to synthesize them into the most appropriate answer to a problem, solution to a problem. And that's what she calls integration. And she says integration is the best way to, well, not best again, most appropriate way to deal with conflict, because through integration, everyone has some buy-in into the final decision making. They all own a piece of that final decision that was made. So therefore, they kind of have this sunk cost. They kind of have this embedded interest. So they're much more likely to be satisfied and to go out there and work toward implementing this decision that has been made. I think this argument from Follett makes a lot of sense to us, certainly in a classroom setting. One of the main limitations with it is in terms of doing it in the real world on a daily basis in organizations. If you have ever had to make a decision in a very short time frame and try to involve all of your decision makers fully, you know that sometimes you're not able to get it done in that time frame. The more people you involve, the more slowly the process tends to go. And there are some situations where organizations have to respond very quickly to changes in their dynamic environment. And so really implementing everyone being able to participate can certainly be problematic. But Follett also realizes that if we are going to encourage participation, people are only going to participate if they feel they have the power to do so. So Follett was always also very interested in this idea of power. And we have identified power before as the ability to influence someone to do something they otherwise would not do, and especially to use resources. to influence someone to do something or decide something they otherwise would not do. Power, according to Follett, is something that is not to be given. It's not something that is to be handed down from leadership down to employees. But instead, Follett argues that power is something that leaders need to help their employees develop, that they need to help them develop their own bases of power and authority, which will then make them much more effective in participating in the decision making of the organization. And this is one of the major criticisms she had with the classical theorists. She said the classical theories are predicated on the idea of power over, where it's very centralizing, very top down. Leaders would exert power over their employees. She says it should be more of a power with process, whereby leaders work to develop their employees as resources so their employees can develop their own power and authority base, which will then make them more likely to participate and make their participation much more fruitful. So again, it's much more of a altruistic, if you will, I like to use the term warmer and fuzzier, approach to dealing with your individual employees. So we try and help them build their power and authority base rather than just giving it to them. Again, Follett says, therefore, effective leaders in democratic organizations are those leaders who are able to help develop the power of their employees rather than just trying to give it to them from above. And so here we start to venture into the whole idea of human resource development. And this is something that will be that major theme of human resource management theorists 30, 40, 50 years after Follett's time period. But Follett is really starting to lay the groundwork for human resource management theory. But if you're looking at when Follett was writing, she's writing in the 1920s. She is still writing at this point in time where most organization theorists were trying to identify principles that could be applied to organizations. So while she has one foot into what will eventually become human relations and human resource management, she still has another foot that is still, maybe unbeknownst to her, is still kind of there in the classical school, in that she recommends to us that there are certain principles that we can implement in our organizations that will make our organizations more democratic and foster participation on the part of our employees. The principles she tells us we need to incorporate. Number one, coordination through integration between departments and individuals. We need to really allow people to participate so that you can have this sharing of ideas, so that we can get an integration of ideas between people within departments, between people in other departments, between departments and departments, and coordinate that integrative process. We need to establish early contact with our employees. So from the time the employee onboards into the organization, we kind of, and she didn't really use the term culture a lot, but we kind of have to build this culture of participation so that they know that participation is valued in the organization and that they have all these different ways in which they can participate. But they should understand that from very early on. So early contact with employees when they enter the organization. We need an organization that is welcoming to all different types of perspectives. Because if you don't welcome all perspectives, you're not going to be able to get to the point of interpenetration of ideas. If you don't have interpenetration of ideas, you'll never get to the point of integration to solve those conflicts. So you have to take all accounts and take into account all perspectives in your organization. And then number four, understand that coordinating this participation and this communication is dynamic. That communication and participation will change depending upon the people involved, depending upon the context of the situation. And this is another added element from Follett. This is another way in which Follett kind of tries to pull us out of the one-size-fits-all approach by telling us we have to remember that coordination of participation communication is dynamic in nature. So it's not going to be static. It's not going to stay the same all the time. So now we have to start taking the situation into account. Another thing that Follett is very well known for is her theory of situational leadership. She felt that people, leaders, need to lead according to the situation in which they find themselves. Again, because this is a dynamic and changing type of situation. So that is Mary Parker Follett and her argument for democratic organizations. As we said, one of the primary criticisms of Follett is that perhaps it's a little bit too idealistic. We may not always have the time and the luxury and the flexibility to do these types of things. Sometimes we have to act very quickly, and we don't have the luxury of involving the participation of everyone in our organizations. But at least on a Tuesday evening, here in an organization theory classroom, I think it makes a great deal of sense to us in terms of if we can make our organizations democratic, like a democratic society, we can foster participation and buy-in on the part of our employees. So, where does Mary Parker Follett and her democratic organization theory fit in terms of our four models of organizational effectiveness? Well, again, here is a situation where I wish we could shade in some of these cells a little bit darker than others, but I agree with Tompkins that certainly human relations model. There's a very big human relations element here. This is one of the first times we've really seen this human relations model come into play. We didn't see it very much in the classical theorists. Now we're seeing it brought to the fore for really the first time with Mary Parker Follett. Internal process. Clearly, we're looking inside the organization at the decision-making processes and the participative processes within the organization. So there's a focus on the internal processes and rational goal. The goal of the organization is to become this democratic organization, and that's what we are working toward is that organizational goal. So I'd agree that all three of those models tend to be emphasized with Mary Parker Follett. It's just the human relations model, I think, is emphasized far more than your other three models with Follett. Then in terms of your control and coordination of work, here really for the first time we have this method known as mutual adjustment. Here in mutual adjustment is where you have workers consulting with each other informally about what needs to be accomplished and how. Responsibility for coordination and control rests with those who are doing the work. So we no longer have this control and coordination responsibility coming down from above. Now we have individual employees who are responsible for the coordination and control of their own work activities, and they accomplish that through participation, consulting with each other, what's called mutual adjustment. Again, this is a great departure from what we saw last week with our classical theorists. And then in terms of our motivational strategies, we have considerate leadership. Again, this is something that is relatively new to us here with Follett. Considerate leadership, where leaders and managers pay attention to employees. They are concerned about their employees' wants and needs. That is a great departure from what we saw with Weber and Taylor. Group acceptance. We're having individual employees consult with each other to coordinate and control work. Obviously, they're going to be doing that in groups. And so, therefore, we value that social aspect of the organization and the benefit we can get through group work. And then job identification. We allow people to participate in defining their own jobs. So they get to participate in determining what types of tasks they do on a daily basis so they can help shape their jobs to fit their eventual goals, their eventual career goals. So they can use these positions in order to develop the skills that they need and to grow as human resources. This is, again, Mary Parker Follett really kind of reaching well into the future and laying some of the groundwork for people like Douglas McGregor and Chris Ardress and some of our other human resource management theorists who will not come along for 4 or 5 decades into the future. So I think Follett is a really good departure point from the classical school and really a good foundation to help segue from the classical school into more neoclassical approaches such as human relations and human resource management. So that's why we always start with Mary Parker Follett, even recognizing that in terms of a contemporary type of perspective, she was not necessarily a contemporary of the human relations theorists, but a lot of their writings very closely mirror what we saw with Mary Parker Follett decades earlier. So Mary Parker Follett gives us this jumping off point to then move into neoclassical schools such as the School of Human Relations. You were introduced to the School of Human Relations in your 500 class, and so you're already have kind of a working familiarity of it. But let's talk a little bit more in depth about what the Human Relations School said about the way in which we structure and operate our organizations. One of the primary theorists that we always focus on with Human Relations School is Elton Mayo, and you've been introduced to Elton Mayo before. Elton Mayo brought to the table his knowledge in the world of psychology. And so he really brought very much of a psychological type of orientation to trying to understand public organizations. So Elton Mayo had his theory that was known as social disorganization and human irrationality. He made the argument that we have social, at that time he was writing, we had social disorganization. And that social disorganization was coming from two primary sources. One source of this social disorganization was human irrationality. He made the argument that these human beings who are working in these organizations tend to be inherently irrational, in that they will make decisions and engage in behaviors that don't always make sense and don't always align with what is best for that individual. So he wanted to explore why we have this type of irrationality among people who are working in organizations. He traces this human irrationality back to the artifacts of the Industrial Revolution. And he says, in the wake of the Industrial Revolution, what we end up having is we end up having the creation of all of these factories and these assembly lines. And these factories started to spring up in major cities. And those major cities were primarily throughout the North. And so you had these industries that were springing up around New York and Cleveland and Detroit and Chicago. And all of these industries needed workers. Well, at the same time, you had all these industries growing in these northern cities. You also had a collapse of the farming community in southern states. And so you had farmers that were losing their farms. When these farmers were losing their farms and going bankrupt, they had to find work somewhere. So these are the folks who then migrated north to these large cities to then take jobs in the factories and the steel plants and the steel mills. This is something that is very familiar to my family history, and that my grandfather had a dairy farm in Kentucky. Whenever the Depression hit, ended up losing that farm. All of his sons then moved, including my father, moved up to the Cleveland area and started working in steel mills. And so my dad moved up and started working in a steel mill, and hence the reason why I'm from Cleveland. And that happened for a lot of families. The problem here, according to Mayo, is that when these people started moving up to these cities, they were doing so at a very young age. So they were moving out of their nuclear family homes at ages 14, 15, and 16, and then moving up to these major cities and taking these jobs in steel mills. Because they were leaving their nuclear families at such a young age, they were still not emotionally developed, if you will. They were still not emotionally mature. And they still had a lot of issues that they had not resolved with their families necessarily. And so when you basically have a bunch of teenagers who are moving up to take these very difficult jobs in these factories and these steel mills, you shouldn't be surprised that they make decisions that someone from the outside would view as being relatively irrational. Says combine that human irrationality of employees in these organizations with the factory system itself. The factory system itself really did focus on the needs of the organization and really did view these employees as just being replaceable cogs in the machinery. So they would be there working for 12 and 14-hour days in the steel mill, 6 days a week, sometimes 7 days a week. They had very few protections in terms of safety. They certainly had no retirement systems. It was a very difficult type of life to live. And those were situations and conditions that were being placed upon them with the factory system that was in place at that time. So I said you take this human irrationality, you compound it with the nature of the factory system, and that is what has led to this, what he called social disorganization. So he made the argument that when we studied organizations, we need to recognize the social needs of employees and the social environment of any organization. So whenever you get human beings into an organization working together in close proximity, that becomes a social type of environment. And we need to realize it's a social environment, and we need to accommodate those types of social needs. So if you've read any Elton Mayo, you know that Mayo and his colleagues did a variety of different types of studies. The relay assembly room test room study, the bank wiring study, the illumination studies. The one that we are most interested in here, obviously, the illumination studies. And in particular, the illumination studies that occurred at the Hawthorne electrical plant. So for those of you who have read Elton Mayo before, or those of you who were introduced to him in PPA 500, does anyone remember about the Hawthorne studies and what happened at the studies of the Hawthorne electrical plant? Does that ring a bell with anyone?
They turned up and down the lights and saw if productivity went up or down. And I think that there wasn't a direct correlation.
Right. Exactly. Thank you. I mean, that's exactly what happened. They thought what we will do is we will look at the relationship between an external physical stimulus and productivity levels. So one of the stimuli that they selected was the lighting level. And so as you say, Emma, they decided, well, we're going to turn up the lighting level. And you would normally think in your hypothesis that as lighting levels went up, productivity levels would go up as well. They raised the lighting levels and productivity went up. Then they said, what happens if we lower the lighting level? Well, you think if you lower the lighting level, it becomes more difficult for people to see what they're doing on a daily basis. So therefore, productivity should go down. But as you say, they found that that was not the relationship. That when they turned the lighting level down, productivity still continued to increase. It was not that physical external stimulus that was affecting productivity, but rather it was paying attention to these employees. These researchers were talking to the employees, they were interviewing the employees, they were actually paying attention to the employees. And so by paying attention to the employees, that then motivated the employees to work harder and to become more productive. So what this led Mayo and his colleagues to realize is that, again, this organization is a social environment. And organizations, in order to be effective, need to recognize that social environment and to need to value things such as employee participation and to also value things such as groups. People would often be much more effective and productive when they are working together in groups as compared to when they are working in a singular fashion. Well, clearly, a group could be more productive because in a group, you have a collective of knowledge, skills, and abilities that should exceed the knowledge, skills, and abilities of one individual. But the groups were performing much greater than that. And they recognized that it went beyond just a collective of knowledge, skills, and abilities. And it really was the social pressure that if one member of the group was not pulling their weight and not being productive, it made the rest of the group look bad. So the other members of the group would then put pressure on that individual to work harder so the group would look more productive. That is that social element of an organization. And so he really starts to focus our attention on the social definition of an organization. Fritz Roethlisberger, who followed up on Mayo's work, agreed that organizations were social types of environments. And he argued that we needed to develop a new discipline that focused on human interactions within these organizations. Roethlisberger's new discipline would focus on number one, communication problems. That if people were having trouble communicating, they would never be able to work together. So identify and rectify communication problems between employees. We talk a lot about communication problems when we talk about leadership. And so, oftentimes in a leadership class, you'll talk about distorted communication. You'll talk about modes of communication, how they can have an impact. But if we can identify the problems and the link breakages in our communication system, rectify those, that will then help us encourage these human interactions. Second part of what he calls his new discipline is having organizations focus on getting cooperation. That to be effective as an organization or as a leader, you need to get the cooperation of your employees. It's no longer good enough, as in the classical school, to say, do this and expect for it to get done. To be effective, you need your employees to cooperate and acquiesce with what you are asking them to do. And then the third part of his discipline is to engender a focus on maintaining individual and organizational equilibrium through change. Understanding that organizations and the social environment within those organizations, that they are very dynamic in nature. And so we need to try and always maintain this balance between what our employees need and what the organization needs. And if we can maintain that type of equilibrium, even through times of change, we will be effective as an organization. So here again, you see not only is Roethlisberger agreeing with Mayo that organizations are social environments, but now he is charging us with the responsibility of actually focusing on these human interactions, learning how we can have people communicate more effectively, how we can have people cooperate more effectively, and how we can balance the needs of the employee with the needs of the organization. So here you see some inherent value being placed upon individual employees that you never saw with the classical school of organization theory. Both Mayo and Roethlisberger are now viewing organizations as social systems. This not only helps to lay the framework for human resource management theory, but here we're also starting to lay the foundation for what we'll talk about next week with a systems theory type of an approach. If we view our organization as a system, it is a system with a lot of interwoven and interacting parts. Some of those parts in our social system of our organization are formal. Some of those parts are informal. So we have formal positions, we have formal scalar chain in our organizational chart, but then we also have informal things such as groups that are not necessarily part of the organizational chart, but they kind of grow up over time because of the psychological need to interact with each other as human beings. I always used to use the example when I taught back in Illinois. In our political science department, we had what was called the lunch bunch. And the lunch bunch was a group of faculty members. They were all I was younger at that time, so I can say this. They were all more veteran faculty members. They were all from actually, all from Southern universities, and they would all get together, and they would all have they were from Ole Miss, and they were from Kentucky, and they were from Alabama, and they would all get together for lunch every single day. And I shared an office with one of them, and so one member of the lunch bunch would come in every single day and peek his head in my door and ask my office mate, "Jeet," and that meant, "Did you eat?" And then he'd say, "Jaunt to," and that was, "Do you want to?" And they would all go to lunch together, and they would do a lot of things at lunch in terms of departmental business. And so whenever you would get together in a faculty meeting, the lunch bunch always tended to vote together, and they always tended to agree on issues together. That's very much of an informal group. And I'm sure if you look at your organization, you can see informal groups within your organization as well. Roethlisberger and Mayo are telling us these informal groups are oftentimes just as important as the formal elements of our organization. Then we also have, as a human relations theorist, our good friend Chester Barnard. And Chester Barnard, we encounter over and over again in the public administration literature. We're talking about Chester Barnard here, talk about human relations theory. We'll talk about Chester Barnard again next week when we talk about systems theory. But Chester Barnard is a human relations theorist because he made the argument to us that leaders can, or managers can only be effective if they are able to get the compliance on the part of their employees. So very similar to that cooperation element in Roethlisberger, here you have it with compliance with Chester Barnard. So Barnard viewed leadership very much from a transactional type of perspective. So he felt leaders were transactional. So as a transactional leader, you have to enter into a transaction with your employee so that you can elicit the contributions from that employee that you need to make your organization effective. So Barnard says what leaders do is they provide selective incentives to their employees. Then if those are selective incentives that are valued by their employees, that will then motivate their employees. And here you go with kind of the connection to motivation theory. That will then motivate those employees to then put forth the amount of effort to then provide contributions that the organization needs. So contributions are things such as their loyalty to the organization, their willingness to stay in the organization for a long period of time, their willingness to put forth the amount of effort that is necessary to get the job done. Those are all contributions that employees can contribute to the organization, but they are more likely to contribute those things if they get incentives provided to them that they place a value upon. So we're here, it's really important in terms of human relations theory that we are recognizing that effectiveness does not come top down from above, but rather effectiveness comes from the compliance on the part of our employees. Barnard also tells us, and this is another important aspect of Barnard, is he tells us that our employees are different from each other, that they're not these replaceable cogs, that every employee has a different set of wants, needs, and desires. So if you provide an incentive to an employee that they don't place a value upon, you're not going to get them motivated to provide the contributions that you need. Also, employees are different in terms of their values and their ethical standards. And this is where he introduces this theory known as the zones of indifference. He argues that every individual employee has a different zone of indifference. I know it's kind of clunky to say it that way, but we'll say a unique zone of indifference. The zone of indifference is if you ask someone to do something and it does not violate their values or their ethical standards, they will probably acquiesce and do it. They will comply because you are operating within their zone of indifference. They're kind of indifferent about it, and so they're probably going to do it. However, if you ask someone to do something that violates their value system, you have now moved outside their zone of indifference, and they are probably not going to comply, and they're going to push back on that. So since every employee has a different zone of indifference or a unique zone of indifference, it's incumbent upon us as leaders to understand what those zones of indifference are for each of our unique employees. So here we go with another addition that moves us farther away from the classical school, the recognition that humans are individuals. And these individuals differ in terms of what they need, want, and desire. They're no longer the Boris piece of Frederick Taylor or the replaceable cogs in the machinery of the classical organization system. Now, we see a lot of human relations theory, Mayo and Roethlisberger and Barnard and others in our contemporary organizations. When you look at your organization probably has counseling programs, what we oftentimes call employee assistance programs or EAPs. Vast majority of modern organizations will have those EAPs. Those EAPs are great examples of human relations theory in practice. Your organization probably has a pretty robust training and development system in place as well. Training development, professional development, that's an artifact of human relations theory. Because again, in human relations theory, we're recognizing that people have different skills, they have different things they want to try and achieve. And so therefore, we will tailor their training and development exposure to their skill set and to what they are trying to achieve as individuals. So that's what we consider to be the school of human relations theory. Now, human relations theory, in terms of the models of organizational effectiveness, clearly the model is going to be human relations. That's pretty obvious to us. We're really focusing on those employees. There is a bit of an internal process because we are looking internal to the organization, but by far the primary dominant model of organizational effectiveness is going to be a human relations type of model. Then in terms of our methods for coordination and control, this may surprise you a little bit, but Tompkins does not shade in mutual adjustment, but rather he shades in direct supervision. Now, I know direct supervision was something that was prominent in the classical school, but the argument here is that paying attention to individual employees, trying to find ways for employees to cooperate and work together, trying to find ways to recognize informal groups and the social environment. All these things that come out of Mayo, Roethlisberger, and Barnard, all these things are being done for the primary purpose of benefiting the organization. So at the end of the day, we are recognizing social environments. We're providing people with the right selective incentives for the purpose of getting contributions from those employees. So there still is somewhat of a centralization type of an approach here because the ultimate goal is still going to be the organization. So it's still, you're looking at the micro level, but the ultimate goal is still a macro level goal, and that is what is best for the organization, what will make the organization as productive as possible. That is one of the criticisms that the human resource management theorists lodged against the human relations theorists. And it is that criticism that then served as the jumping off point for the creation of the School of Human Resource Management. Motivational strategies. Here we have instrumental rewards such as considerate leadership and obviously group acceptance. There can also be rewards for performance if that reward is an incentive under Barnard that's meant to garner more contributions. Now, obviously, there's not a whole lot of talk here about pay for performance because in the public sector, we all know how difficult it is to do pay for performance. But if there are incentives that exist, such as recognition for a job well done, being made the employee of the week or whatever that case may be, that will then also serve as an instrumental reward. So I think you could probably shade that one in very lightly, but the real emphasis here is on group acceptance and considerate leadership. But very much this idea of rewarding employees in order to continue to gain the contributions that you need from those employees. But again, that primary critique of the human relations school is the critique made by McGregor and others that it was very exploitative, that you're paying attention to individual employees, you are recognizing the differences between them for the purpose of getting contributions from them. You're exploiting their talents to benefit the productivity of the organization. And it is that critique that then served, as I said, to the launching point for what we consider to be modern human resource management theories. This is what we are most familiar with in our contemporary organizations. We do a lot of HRM, human resource management. The PPA 577 course that you have taken or will take, that course is called Human Resource Management for a reason. Back when I started teaching back in Illinois, my first class that I taught was public personnel management. And the first thing I did was change the title through the curriculum process to human resource management. Because now we're no longer just managing personnel. We are now trying to help develop those individuals as resources. And that's the big difference here. So in human relations, you are paying attention to people and their wants, needs, and desires to benefit the organization as opposed to the person. Here in modern human resource management theory, now you are not only trying to be effective as an organization, but you're also trying to develop the person as a human resource. If that individual receives this professional development and decides to then leave the organization, that is considered acceptable under human resource management theory because helping someone develop as a human being is sometimes equally as important as the organization's productivity. So there is inherent value here in developing people as human resources. This is where the relationship between the organization and the employee becomes that two-way street. And that's no longer what the individual can do for the organization, but now it's what can the organization do for the employee to help develop that employee as a human resource. So as you probably remember from your previous course, as well as any other training you've had in public administration, one of the first places we start with human resource management theory is with Abraham Maslow. And when we're looking at modern human resource management theory, we are talking about beginning in the 1950s and really going up to the contemporary period of time. With human relations, we were talking more about the 30s and the 40s and the 50s. Here we're going 50s up to the present. So with Abraham Maslow, and we won't spend a lot of time on him because you probably remember him from 500, but Abraham Maslow now brings a very psychological type of orientation to understanding individual employee motivations. He introduces us to his hierarchy of needs, which you're familiar with. You have these 5 different levels of needs: physiological, safety, belongingness, esteem, and self-actualization. The bottom 4 needs, physiological, safety, belongingness, and esteem, are all considered to be deficiency needs, meaning that they motivate people if people have a deficiency in one of those needs. So if you are deficient in your feeling for safety, you are motivated by trying to feel more secure. But once you feel more secure, that will stop then motivating you. If you don't have enough food to eat, you are motivated until you are not hungry anymore, and then that ceases to be a motivator. So those 4 bottom needs are the deficiency needs. The top need of self-actualization is the growth need. This is a need that never ends. This is something that continues. And self-actualization was defined as the ability to achieve one's full potential. It's kind of what the Army used to tell us: be all that you can be. So if you can achieve your fullest potential, you're always working toward that. So that is a non-ending type of need. It's referred to then as a growth need because you're motivated to continue to grow, to continue to get better, to continue to make progress toward full potential, to full self-actualization. That's the approach that Maslow took throughout most of his career. Later in his life, he kind of changed this up a little bit, and he changed self-actualization, that growth need, to more of a giving back to your community and society type of need. And so later in life, when he reoriented this hierarchy of needs, instead of self-actualization being at the apex of the pyramid, the growth need then became the need to try and give back to others and to leave a legacy when you leave this world. And so it kind of went beyond just you as an individual and went to what you can do for others. But that was kind of his revision later on in life before his death. But the idea here with Abraham Maslow, this hierarchy of needs, is every employee has a hierarchy of needs, but the ordering of this hierarchy could differ between employees, which means that what you are doing as an organization is you are trying to help people work towards self-actualization. But the ways in which you do it will be unique to the individual. So for some individuals, esteem needs may be more important than their need for belongingness. And so that's a different prioritization. So it places a burden a responsibility on the leader and the manager to know their individual employees, to kind of have an idea of what their individual hierarchy of needs really looks like, and then to try and help that person work toward fulfilling those needs and eventually working toward the growth need of self-actualization or the growth need of trying to leave a legacy for others when you are gone. So again, individual employees are not just cogs in the machinery, they're not boorish beasts, and we have an obligation as an organization to help with the growth of our individual employees. It's this two-way street between employee and organization. Douglas McGregor, who approaches this from a very kind of organizational type of perspective, wrote his most famous work, The Human Side of the Enterprise. And building upon Abraham Maslow, Douglas McGregor made the argument, as you probably know, that there are two different types of employees. There are Theory X and Theory Y employees. Theory X employees are those lazy, not very creative, not very innovative, not very intelligent individuals. Theory Y employees are just the opposite. They are intelligent, they are creative, they are innovative. For them, work is as natural as leisure. The important thing with Douglas McGregor is that he argues that the vast majority of our employees are Theory Y employees, but the vast majority of our organizations are Theory X organizations. So Theory Y employees are trapped within Theory X organizations. So the solution for that is to transform our Theory X organizations into Theory Y organizations. He says that's a difficult process, but to successfully transition from a Theory X to a Theory Y organization, you are going to need to adopt a lot of the principles like we saw with Mary Parker Follett, which is why I said there's a strong connection here between Follett and McGregor. He argues that we need to allow people to participate in their own governance. We need to allow people to participate in self-determination when it comes to their jobs and the types of duties and the tasks that they are doing on a daily basis. So we really have to allow people that type of participation and self-determination in order to help those individuals grow and develop as human resources. Douglas McGregor's student was Chris Argyris. And Chris Argyris took Douglas McGregor's work and built upon it. And he built upon it with his personal growth theory. So according to Chris Argyris, yes, he believed that the majority of our employees were making progress toward being Theory Y employees, but it is a process. And he says every person goes through a personal growth journey. And through this personal growth type of trajectory, people will start to experience the following. They will experience increased activism. They will become more active in their environments, whether it be becoming more active in participating in the life of the organization or becoming more active in participating in their society, in their community. They become more active members of their communities. They increase their independence. They become more independent thinkers and independent actors as they go through this personal growth journey. They develop the ability to behave in a multiplicity of ways. So it's not just one way, there are multiple different ways in which they learn how to behave. They develop much deepening interests. So the interests are much deeper and much more sophisticated than they have been in the past. They start taking on a longer time perspective. So it's not all about what's going to happen to me tomorrow, but it's about what's going to happen to me and my family and my community in the long run. So 10, 15, 20 years down the road. They begin to aspire to superordinate positions. So they aspire to these highly responsible leadership positions. They develop much greater self-awareness. Essentially, what we oftentimes refer to as a component of emotional maturity. So they become much more emotionally mature. They become much more self-aware. They become much more comfortable in themselves as human beings. So that's what happens through this personal growth process. Ardress argues the problem is that theory X organizations, classic organization theory, inhibits this personal growth process. Ardress argues that it's incumbent on the organization to help people move through this personal growth process and to help them develop as human resources. So, providing them with the opportunities to aspire to these superordinate positions and to develop the skill sets and the temperament that are necessary to serve effectively in these supervisory types of positions. Giving them the flexibility to behave in a multiplicity of different ways, giving them the independence in doing their work on a daily basis and the ability to be active in determining what type of work needs to be done and how that work should be accomplished. So one of the primary ways in which we do that in both McGregor as well as Ardress is through the process of job identification. So if we can allow people to identify with their jobs by creating their own jobs and by determining what types of activities and tasks they will do on a daily basis in those jobs, we are then enriching those jobs. And by enriching those jobs, people see that they can achieve their goals by doing their daily work. And that then motivates them to obviously work harder. It allows them to then identify with their jobs and to identify more closely with the organization itself. But again, the big thing here with human resource management theory that really sets it apart from human relations theory is this two-way street that we talked about. It's not only what the individual can give to the organization, but what can the organization do for the individual in helping that individual develop as a human resource. So when we look at human resource management theory as kind of its own little sub-school of thought, and we look at it in terms of models of organizational effectiveness, we clearly have an emphasis on a human relations approach. We clearly have an emphasis on the internal process because we're looking at employees within our organization and how to structure their work and have them structure their own work in terms of job identification and job enrichment. We still have a focus on goals. It's just now it's not only the organization's goals, but it's also the ability for individual employees to achieve their own goals as well. So I think all three of those models are certainly emphasized in human resource management theory. Not a whole lot on open systems because still we are operating within the organization itself. Methods for control and coordination of work, very clearly here, we're back to mutual adjustment like with Mary Parker Follett. Workers are consulting with each other. Leaders are consulting with those workers. Workers have some input in terms of what they do on a daily basis. And as we had already mentioned, the primary motivational strategy is going to be job identification. The more they have a role in determining their jobs, the more likely they are to identify with those jobs and to see how those jobs will help them grow and achieve their self-actualization and on a more limited scale, their future career goals as well. So hopefully from this discussion up to this point in time, we can kind of see how far we have come from the school of classic organization theory through HR and HRM. We have moved away from this idea of what the organization can get from the individual and are starting to look more at what the individual can also get from the organization. Most notably, though, we are starting to move away from the one-size-fits-all approach and recognizing that organizations are dynamic and that we have to be very flexible and be very adaptive in the way in which we structure work, in the way in which we manage and encourage the participation of our employees. So it's no longer a one-size-fits-all approach. Now it is a much more contextual approach. And that more contextual, contingency-based approach is really the way in which we truly characterize more modern organization theories. Oops. So I've been talking for a while tonight, and I realize that. So let me break at this point and ask you, do you have any questions or any clarifications on this progression that we've made away from the classical school through our neoclassical schools, such as human relations and human resource management? If not, then instead of, we're going to take a break now, so don't worry, but we'll take a break in a second. But instead of moving into breakout rooms after our break, I do want to introduce you to motivational theories because motivational theories really did grow directly out of human resource management theory, and there's a lot of overlap between our motivational school and our human resource management school. So we'll take a break for about 10, well, yeah, we'll take a break to about 7:30, come back at 7:30, and then instead of breakout rooms, we'll talk a little bit about motivational school, and then we'll see how much time we have when we're done with that. I don't think we'll have time for breakout rooms tonight, but we'll kind of play it by ear and see how long it takes us to talk about the School of Motivation Theory. So take a 10-minute break, come back at 7:30, and we'll talk motivation. It's 7:30, so welcome back from break. Again, what I'd like to do now is just kind of introduce you to some of the highlights in the School of Motivation Theory. And again, we talk about motivation theory here because it dovetails so well with human resource management theory. And you'll notice some of the theorists we talked about here in the School of Motivation Theory are the same theorists that we just talked about with HRM. And so you're going to be very familiar with some of these theorists because we just talked about them. But motivational theory really grew out of human resource management because we understood that employee motivation is an important prerequisite for not only organizational productivity, but for the development of individual employees as human resources. The School of Motivation Theory, as it really evolved, came to the realization that unlike Frederick Taylor and his scientific management theory, there really is no science of motivation. Motivation theory really instead focuses more on an identification of the techniques and the ideas and the insights that can help leaders and managers better motivate their employees. But we also recognize that motivating employees is far more challenging here in the public as compared to the private sector. Because obviously, here in the public sector, we have intrinsic incentives, and we oftentimes lack the extrinsic incentives that most private sector corporations have. So the constraining elements of government sometimes make motivation far more challenging than in the private sector. So in terms of the context of motivation, we understand that motivation in the public sector, as we said, is far more difficult than the private sector. And the reason why motivation is more difficult is number one, the constraints that we face. We have very complex structures. Our organizations themselves tend to be highly complex. They tend to be highly fragmented, not only in terms of their structure, but also in terms of power and authority. We also know that there's a serious limitation on our ability, as we said, to provide incentives through these extrinsic types of incentives. So we don't have the pay for performance. And if you're interested in some of the literature on the unique nature of incentives in the public sector, Hal Rainey and Rex Facer have done a lot of work in that area. And so those are a couple of good authors to take a look at. But we're very constrained in what we can provide for our employees in terms of their incentives. Also, another part of the context of motivation in a public organization is the amount of ambiguity that exists. As we've talked about before, there's a lot of goal ambiguity. If you have employees who don't know what goal they are working toward, they are probably going to be difficult to motivate to achieve those goals. Unstable and ambiguous expectations. Our performance expectations are very difficult for us to establish in the public sector for a lot of the reasons that we had talked about in a previous week. A lack of cohesion among our work groups. There's a lack of cohesion in our public organizations. You probably see that currently in your organization today. When you lack that cohesion, obviously there's going to be an impact on motivation. And then obviously those external influences. And the primary external influence that really has a depressing impact upon motivation for public employees is the negative view of the bureaucracy. We know that people tend to hold the bureaucracy in very low regard. Members of the public, when they hear the word bureaucracy, think of red tape, they think of impersonal, they think of inefficiency, ineffectiveness. Today, they oftentimes think about corruption and waste. So people really have a negative view. And when people have a negative view of the bureaucracy, they tend to also then have a negative view of the bureaucrats, the administrators within those organizations. Facing those negative perceptions, again, makes it very difficult for us to motivate our employees. So the basic question is, what is motivation in a public organization? In general, work motivation refers to a person's desire to work hard and work well, and to put forth that effort on a consistent basis. So a desire to work hard, work well, and to put that effort forth on a consistent basis. That is essentially our basic definition we're going to be using tonight for the term motivation. So when we want to measure motivation in our motivational theories, by definition, to measure motivation, you have to extract that information directly from public employees. And if you take in research methods, you know how difficult it is to extract information from human subjects and to do it without committing measurement error. It's very difficult to get a true and clear and unvarnished and unbiased representation of how people actually feel, their perceptions, and their opinions. But the way in which we normally do it is obviously through surveys. So when we measure motivation of public employees, we can use a variety of different types of surveys. And I'm just giving you a real quick overview of an example of some of the ways in which we can measure employee motivation. One way we can do it is what's called the job motivation scale. And the job motivation scale is a simple questionnaire that is comprised of some direct measures of job motivation with questions such as, on most days on your job, how often does time seem to drag for you? Some people are completely involved in their job. They're absorbed in it day, night, and day. For other people, their job is simply one of several interests. How involved do you feel with your job? How often do you do some extra work for your job that isn't really required of you? Would you say that you work harder, less hard, or about the same as other people doing your type of work in the organization? So again, these are just some real quick questions that can give us a measure of how motivated individuals are in their jobs. A second type of survey that we use is a work motivation scale. I put forth my best effort to get the job done regardless of difficulties. I am willing to start work early or stay late to finish the job. It has been hard for me to get very involved in my job. That's a reverse question. As we know in our surveys, we oftentimes like to do reverse questions as kind of a test, retest type of an approach to make sure that we are getting true and accurate reflections of how people feel. So that will be reversed. I do extra work for my job that isn't really expected of me. And then another reverse indicator, time seems to drag while I'm on the job. Obviously, if they answer strongly agree to that, clearly that's a poor indicator of motivation. Then you have Lawler and Hall's intrinsic motivation scale. Intrinsic motivation refers to the motivating effects of the work itself. So we're looking at the intrinsic motivation of the work itself. When I do my work well, it gives me a feeling of accomplishment. When I perform my job well, it contributes to my personal growth and development. I feel a great sense of personal satisfaction when I do my job well. Doing my job well increases my self-esteem. So here we're looking at the intrinsic nature of the job and how much it motivates employees. Another one that comes from Hal Rainey is reward expectancies. So this is something that we oftentimes do, at least the federal government would do it with their federal employee attitude or viewpoint survey. I think I have provided a link for you to that on our Canvas site. We're not going to go through and take a look at it, but it does provide us with some insight in terms of the motivational and engagement levels of federal employees. It is a survey that was done by OPM, the Office of Personnel Management, every single year. Last year was the final year that was being done. The administration has taken the survey offline and probably will not do it again. So if it does not get revived by a future administration, 2025 is probably the final year for this federal employee attitude survey. But in this survey, you ask people about how satisfied they are with the rewards that they are receiving for the work they're accomplishing and how much those rewards are motivating them. So, producing a high quality of work increases my chance for higher pay. Producing a high quality of work increases my chances for a promotion. So do they really do feel that these incentives of higher pay and promotion are truly linked to doing higher quality work? Clearly, if they don't feel that, then the reward expectancies are not being met, and that's going to have a negative impact upon motivation. And then finally, another way we can measure motivation is through peer evaluations of individual work motivation. So in this method of measuring motivation, federal employees are going to evaluate an individual's work motivation on the following dimensions. So you're going to be evaluating a peer on their team attitude, task concentration, their level of independence or ability to be a self-starter, their identification with the organization itself, their persistence in terms of how they persist with work, even when that work is difficult, and then their professional identification. So we're evaluating the motivation of our colleagues and our peers. So those are just some ways in which we can measure motivation. Again, if you want to get some insight into the motivational levels of federal employees, at least as of 2025, there's a link here and also a link on our Canvas site so you can take a look at that annual survey that's done by OPM. Really interesting findings in that survey. Larger organizations tend to have lower employee motivational levels as compared to smaller organizations. And there are a lot of takeaways that come from that survey, but I'll let you take a look at that on your own. So the literature realizes that motivation is an important predeterminant of performance and productivity. However, it is not the only measure and determinant of performance. It is one of these examples of something that is necessary but not sufficient. There are other factors that obviously have independent influences on performance and productivity, the ability of the employee, the level of training of the employee, how well the employee is prepared for their jobs, and the person's perception about their ability to perform the job well. All those are in addition to motivation. And so there are a lot of other things that contribute to performance here. We are just looking at the impact of motivation on productivity in our public organizations. So these work motivation theories can really be broken up into two broad categories. What we consider to be the content-based theories and the process-based theories. Content-based theories of motivation are concerned with analyzing the particular needs, motives, and rewards that affect motivation. So here you're looking at the actual content, the actual substance of the motivators themselves. So what really does motivate someone to be more productive? And then there are other theories that are process-based theories. These process-based theories look more at the psychological and behavioral processes that underlie motivation. So content versus process. So we're going to divide our discussion up into those two broad categories. So in terms of some of the content-based motivational theorists, some of these we are very familiar with. We just finished talking about Maslow and his hierarchy of needs. We just finished talking about McGregor and his theory X and theory Y. But in addition to those two, we're also going to talk about Frederick Herzberg and his two-factor theory, and then David McClellan and his needs-based model of motivation. So those are the four most prominent content-based motivational theories. Maslow, we don't have to spend time on because we've already seen and talked about it a few minutes ago. This hierarchy of needs, people are motivated either to fulfill a deficiency or they are motivated to continue to grow and aspire towards self-actualization. Those of that deficiency, that growth needs, those are the content of what motivates individual employees. Secondly, with Douglas McGregor, who we already looked at, we know that Theory X employees are motivated differently than Theory Y employees. Theory X is that traditional theory that says people lack the capacity for self-motivation and direction. So therefore, the organization must control them. Theory Y says that people have the ability to be self-motivated, appeal to Maslow's higher order types of needs, emphasize those needs when designing organizations, and to make those jobs more interesting and responsible. So the better we can enrich those jobs, the better people identify with those jobs, and the better those jobs can then serve as motivators for higher levels of productivity. Frederick Herzberg introduces us to his two-factor theory. You may have talked about Herzberg in other classes, but Herzberg makes the argument that there are two main types of factors that will have a differential impact upon motivation. There's one category of factors he calls motivators, and there's another category he calls hygiene factors. Motivating factors are those intrinsic incentives, things such as the interest in work on the part of the individual, the desire for achievement, and the aspiration toward those higher order needs. So primarily intrinsic incentives are what he considers to be true motivators for performance. Hygiene factors are those extrinsic types of things. Those are extrinsic incentives such as pay for performance, these types of organizational rewards, and organizational conditions. Things such as feeling safe from harm and feeling comfortable in the workplace. Those are considered to be hygiene factors. They are external. Herzberg argues that hygiene factors, these extrinsic types of incentives, can only prevent job dissatisfaction. So they can only keep people from being dissatisfied. But if you really want to motivate individuals, you need to focus on those intrinsic motivators. So those things such as interest in work, interest in achievement, those higher order self-actualization needs. It's those motivators that really contribute to performance. Hygiene factors will not. Hygiene factors will only keep someone from being dissatisfied. And keeping an employee from being dissatisfied is different than motivating an employee to be more productive and achieve a higher performance level. And then our fourth content-based motivational theorist is McClellan. And McClellan introduces us to his needs-based model. According to McClellan, there are three different types of motivational needs. There's achievement motivation, there's authority power motivation, and there's affiliation motivation. He argues of these three different motivators, it is achievement motivation that is the most important determinant of productivity and higher levels of performance. He defines achievement motivation as being a dynamic restlessness to achieve mastery over one's environment through success at achieving goals by one's own cunning, ability, and effort. So it's the ability of that individual to achieve mastery over their environment using their own abilities and their own efforts and their own cunning. That's what he says is achievement motivation. And he argues that achievement motivation for most Theory Y employees, that is going to be the primary motivator, far more so than power and authority or affiliation. Now, to link this back to Chris Argyris in human resource management theory, The argument here would go that the farther along someone is in their personal growth process, the more important achievement motivation will be for them. So people who are now very far along in their personal growth process might be more motivated by affiliation, kind of this feeling of belongingness and being part of something. That's for someone who is not quite as far along in their personal growth process. But for those Theory Y employees who are far in that growth process, it's going to be that achievement type of motivator. So if you want to compare your content theories of motivation to each other, they kind of compare like in this chart I have on the screen. So Maslow's deficiency types of needs are going to correlate with the theory X of Douglas McGregor, the hygiene factors of Herzberg, and the power and affiliation motivators of McClellan. Self-actualization and to a degree, a little bit of self-esteem from Maslow, that will correlate to theory Y from McGregor, the motivating factors for Herzberg, and the achievement motivators for McClellan. So the top are the more higher order, the bottom are the more lower order types of needs. That's kind of how those four relate to each other. But beyond just those four content-based theories of motivation, it is also important to recognize that regardless of the theory you rely upon, employees will probably not feel motivated if they do not feel that they are being treated in an equitable manner. And that's what brings us to another author, Adams' equity theory scale. Adams argues that in order for people to feel motivated, they must feel that the outputs they're getting from doing their job at least balance the inputs, the contributions that they are giving to the organization. So at the very least, you must have that perceived balance. So some of the inputs, some of the contributions that people give to their organizations, doing their job, giving their time, giving their effort, their ability, their flexibility, their commitment, their honesty, their collegiality, their heart, their integrity, the amount of respect that they give to the organization and others. Those are the contributions, the inputs that they are giving to the organization. In exchange for those inputs, they expect to get certain outputs. So they get a paycheck, they get benefits, they get vacation time, they get security, they get recognition, they get levels of responsibility and respect, they get a sense of purpose, and they get a sense of achievement. So Adams' equity theory scale says you at least have to have that perceived balance before you can have employees who are motivated to put forth effort. If the amount of input is greater than the amount of output, so if there's a perception that rewards do not match effort, that's when you get reduced input, you get reduced effort, you get reduced commitment, and you get reduced flexibility. So it's important that that equity and that balance exists for employees. It's also important from an equity perspective that when employees view their organizations, they view their organizations as being just organizations. So this introduces to us the term of organizational justice. There are two main types of justice in organizations. There's distributional justice and procedural justice. In distributive or distributional justice, we are looking at a fairness and equity in how in the distribution of these rewards and resources. So who gets what? So if someone feels that someone who is not doing as good of a job as them will be getting more in rewards than they are getting, then that's a violation of distributive justice. So it really looks at the distribution, who gets what in terms of rewards and resources. Then there is procedural justice, which looks at the fairness with which people feel employees are treated with the organizational processes such as decision making. So do people feel the processes are fair? So do they feel there's distributive justice in terms of who gets what? And do they feel the process of giving out those rewards is also just and fair? Clearly, and kind of commonsensical that Perceptions of higher level or higher levels of organizational justice are strongly correlated with positive work-related attitudes, which are then positively correlated with higher levels of motivation. So, organizations that are viewed as just organizations can utilize these content-based theories in order to motivate their employees to achieve higher levels of performance and to be more productive. The second category of motivational theories are these process-based theories. And they come to us from people we have not talked about yet, you may not have talked about yet in the program. They come to us from people like Victor Vroom and his expectancy theory, B.F. Skinner and his operant conditioning and reinforcement theory, Albert Bandura in his social learning cognitive theory, and Gary Locke in his goal setting theory. So these are for what we consider to be process-based theories. So we look at motivation through the lens of not necessarily the substance, but rather the process through which we are motivating our employees. So one of my favorite theories of all time is Victor Vroom and expectancy theory. The primary claim in expectancy theory is that an individual considering an outcome will sum up the values of all the possible outcomes that will result from a course of action, and each outcome will then be weighted by the probability of its occurrence. That's kind of a long-winded way of saying that this is kind of your classic utilitarian type of idea. That people are classic utilitarians. They are rational, self-interested human beings. As a rational, self-interested utilitarian, an individual is going to try and maximize pleasure while minimizing pain. So they're going to balance the good with the bad. They're going to balance the rewards they get with the amount of effort that they have to exert. So essentially what Vroom is telling us is we can predict motivation. We can predict the amount of effort an employee will put into a task by understanding the types of rewards that are being provided and how much those employees value those rewards. So essentially, Vroom's expectancy theory is predicated upon three main concepts. The first concept is what's known as valence. Valence refers to the emotional orientations people hold with respect to outcomes or rewards. In other words, how important is this reward to that individual? How much valence, how much value is placed upon this reward? This reward, such as additional pay, flexibility, challenge in the position, those are all potential rewards. How much do they value those potential rewards? That's what's called the valence level of the reward. Then the second concept is expectancy. Employees will have different expectations for themselves and different levels of confidence in their own capabilities. So how confident is an employee that they put forth this amount of effort that they will accomplish the outcome that they are trying to accomplish? And then the third concept is instrumentality. This refers to the perception on the part of the employee that these outcomes and these rewards will actually result if they put forth the effort and achieve the outcome that they are trying to achieve. So motivation is going to be a function of the amount of effort they put in will be a function of valence, expectancy, and instrumentality. So the way in which it works is in this kind of strange looking formula. And I don't think that Vroom actually anticipated that people are going to carry a calculator around with them and actually calculate the terms in this formula to determine how much effort to exert. But from a more kind of general esoteric level, I think that people will consider these things in deciding how much effort they exert on the job. So to kind of decipher this formula on the screen, F stands for function. So it means a function of. So the amount of effort, which is motivation, that an employee is going to exert will be a function of your first term, which is E to P. E stands for level of effort, and P stands for level of performance. So what is the probability that if they put forth this amount of effort, that this amount of effort will then result in this level of performance? So is there a 50% chance that if they come in and work on a weekend, that they will get this project done by the start of the workday on Monday morning? So what's the likelihood that that's going to happen? So that percentage then gets multiplied by this next term, which is the probability that P, performance, will lead to a certain type of O, which stands for outcome. So if they do get this project done by Monday morning, what are the chances that getting this project done will result in the outcome, the reward that they have been promised? So perhaps the manager promises that if you get this project done by Monday morning, I will then name you Employee of the Week or whatever the reward happens to be. So what's the probability? What's their instrumentality? Their belief that the leader, the manager, will actually come through on their promises of delivering this reward. And that's your probability of performance leading to the outcome. And then that then gets multiplied times V. And V stands for that valence level we discussed earlier, which is the amount of value that they place upon that outcome. So when you work through that formula, it tells you that someone's performance is going to be based upon how much confidence they have in their ability that putting forth the effort will result in this level of performance, how much trust they have in their manager that this promised reward will actually accrue to them if they achieve this level of performance, and then how much value they place upon that reward on that outcome. So the implications in terms of managers trying to motivate their employees in the public sector, managers must understand what individual employees place a value upon. Which of these extrinsic and intrinsic incentives are valued by the employee and how much? Secondly, they have to understand the confidence level of their employees in their ability and to accurately assess the strengths and weaknesses of that employee in terms of being able to get the job done. And then third, they have to understand instrumentality. They have to understand that they need to come through on these promises, that they promise employees a certain outcome, a certain reward for achieving a level of performance. They need to deliver on that promise. Clearly, if you have employees who are 90% sure that yes, this leader is going to come through on their promise of making me employee of the month, clearly that's going to increase the amount of effort that they're going to put forth. It's going to make them more motivated to accomplish whatever they are trying to accomplish. So I do like Victor Vroom's theory, expectancy theory. I think where we stand now with expectancy theory is that we in the literature tend to use expectancies as dependent variables. So what we basically try and do is we basically try and look at the relationship between performance and pay, job security, promotional opportunities, and incentives to see what that relationship is between those types of outcomes and the amount of effort that an employee is going to put into doing their daily jobs. So actually, it's really that amount of effort, that expectancy in terms of effort that serves as the dependent variable in a lot of the models that we build today in motivation theories. Expectancy theory and its use in public organizations, I think we can see that expectancy theory really does kind of underpin a lot of our civil service reforms and government pay systems. If you've had the 577 course and you've talked about civil service reform in the late 1970s, you know that one of the major elements of the Civil Service Reform Act was the creation of the Senior Executive Service and the creation of bonus pay for the Senior Executive Service members. That was the recognition that bonus pay would be a very important outcome that these employees would place a high value, high valence level on, and would then help to motivate these employees to make their organizations more productive and more effective. So a lot of this we see in a lot of those civil service reforms that we witnessed in especially the late 1970s and the continued attempt to continue to try and incorporate pay for performance into the public sector. And again, that's met with a whole lot of resistance, as we've talked about. So that's Victor Vroom. That's expectancy theory. That is our first, what we consider to be process-based motivational theory. A second process-based motivational theory comes directly from the world of psychology, and that's what's known as operant conditioning, coming from B.F. Skinner. If you've taken any psychology classes, you have been exposed to B.F. Skinner before. You know, B.F. Skinner's operant conditioning is really based upon the notion that animals will develop behaviors in response to external stimuli and to multiple external stimuli. They then develop these behaviors that are produced and operate on the environment, which then generate consequences. People and animals, but here we're going to shift our attention to people now. People tend to repeat behaviors that they are rewarded for and drop or extinguish behaviors that they are penalized for. So those external types of consequences will condition people to engage in certain types of behaviors. And that's essentially what I refer to as operant conditioning, the use of consequences to modify the occurrence and the form of behavior. It looks at this relationship between observable behavior and reinforcements. So providing these reinforcements, providing these types of consequences will then reinforce and hopefully cement good behaviors and will then get rid of and extinguish bad behaviors or behaviors that detract from performance and productivity. So what B.F. Skinner has found in terms of operant conditioning, or what he did find, because this is a theory that's a few decades old, is that positive reinforcement tends to be the most efficient means of influence behavior. Punishment, negative reinforcement, tends to be less efficient and effective at shaping behavior. So usually it's those positive reinforcements that will serve as the most effective motivators. Also, your reinforcement schedule in terms of how those consequences and when they're provided can also have a major impact upon motivation and upon those behaviors. What they found is an intermittent reinforcement schedule where these consequences are being provided in a highly variable interval patterns, which are not routine. That it's those highly variable interval patterns that tend to have the major impact upon reinforcing behaviors. They solidify and cement behaviors much better than if you had a more routine type of reinforcement schedule. But essentially, with operant conditioning, we are saying that people respond to consequences, and those consequences, hopefully positive, will then help to bolster motivation. Then we have Albert Bandura and his social learning theory, which is our third process-based theory. Bandura builds social learning theory directly off of B.F. Skinner and operant conditioning. In Bandura's social learning theory, he understands that it's not all about consequences, but rather it's about the internal cognitive learning process of the individual. So it places a great emphasis on this internal cognitive process, like the ability of people to set goals for themselves, their sense of self-efficacy, as we talked about previously when we talked about Mary Parker Follett. Those internal cognitive processes are really the focus of social learning theory. Essentially, what Bandura is telling us is that people oftentimes learn from observing situations and from observing the behavior of others. Essentially, what social learning theory says is that people learn in a multitude of ways other than just being given these extra reinforcements like in operant conditioning. People learn by modeling the behavior of others. If you've done any work in leadership, you know that leaders have what we call an expository role. An expository role means that leaders need to be role models. if they can role model truthfulness and honesty and integrity and public value, then by role modeling that behavior, that is behavior that will then be kind of cemented into the learning process of their employees. And that's part of this social cognitive learning type of theory. So people learn through modeling the behavior of others. People also learn through vicarious experiences. So an employee does not need to necessarily experience something negative themselves to learn from it. They can see someone else experiencing something and learn from that. So they see someone experiencing a negative consequence from a certain type of behavior. They will then, through their internal cognitive process, kind of internalize that's a behavior I should not do. So they don't have to get the actual consequence. They learn vicariously through someone else. People engage in social cognitive learning through mental rehearsal and imagery. And so, if you've ever had to give a big presentation in your agency, you may rehearse this over and over in your mind and imagine what an effective presentation is going to look and sound like. That is social learning theory. That will then guide and mold your behavior. And then people also self-manage by setting goals for themselves and then learning how to achieve those goals that they are trying to achieve. So self-learning theory takes it out of the external consequences of operant conditioning and really starts looking internal at the thought process and the learning process of individual employees. And so if you can help shape their cognitive learning processes, that can help shape their behaviors, which can then lead to higher levels of productivity. And then the next theory is Locke's, I may say Gary meant Edwin Locke's theory of goal setting theory. Edwin Locke makes the argument that with goal setting theory, we can motivate individual employees through the establishment of goals. So if we can help them establish goals for their own performance, those goals can be motivators to help them achieve higher levels of productivity. The theory simply states that difficult goals oftentimes lead to higher performance levels than easy to achieve goals, no goals, or vague and ambiguous goals. It sounds kind of counterintuitive that a difficult goal will lead to higher levels of performance, but it really makes people strive toward achieving that goal. It's kind of similar to what we know as what's called field theory. So what we've done is we've gone to the world of physics and we have borrowed field theory from the world of physics and applied it to our understanding of employees in the public sector. Field theory and public organization theory essentially says that we as human beings operate within this set of fields. We operate within this field of all these different forces that are influencing us on a daily basis. So, you think about it as a human being. When you exist on a daily basis, you are in a field of gases. You can't see those gases. You can kind of feel them. If you move your hands really fast, you can kind of understand that you're in a field of gases. But those are all forces that are being brought to bear on you and your existence, as our physicists will tell us. But it's the same type of thing here in the public sector, that we exist within this field of forces. And in this field of forces, these forces that are kind of affecting us, these forces will create a tension. So if we have unaccomplished tasks, so we have established a goal for ourselves, and we're trying to accomplish tasks to achieve that goal, but we have fallen short of accomplishing all of our tasks and therefore fallen short of our goal, we feel a tension from our field of forces that will make us work harder to achieve that goal. So essentially, the more difficult a goal is, the less likely we are to achieve it right away, which increases the amount of tension we feel. And the only way to relieve that tension is by working harder toward achieving our goals. Hence the reason why difficult goals oftentimes motivate much better than simple or easier to achieve types of goals. Difficult goals are also goals that we tend to be more committed to. We have more respect for those goals. We think that they are more important goals, and so therefore we're going to be more committed to those goals. As the value of the goal increases, our commitment to that goal increases as well. So goals can affect our behavior in a variety of different ways. Goals can direct our attention to certain types of tasks and duties. Goals can intensify our effort, as we said, motivate us to higher levels of performance. Goals can intensify our persistence, that those more difficult to achieve goals are the goals that we are going to stick with and work harder to try and achieve. And goals can also spark our creativity in problem solving and make us be more innovative and think more creatively about ways in which we can achieve those goals. And as we said, the assignment of difficult goals tends to lead to higher motivational levels and higher levels of performance because of this tension we need to release by achieving these types of goals. So, in establishing goals for the purpose of motivation, there are several things organizations need to be mindful of in setting their goals. One thing they need to be mindful of is that goals work best with management support. Secondly, the greater the success, the greater of the satisfaction. Like we said, this paradox, more difficult goals are less likely to be achieved, leaving people unsatisfied, which in turn fosters ambition, pushes people to put forth more effort and be motivated to strive to achieve more. Goals tend to work well for motivation when there are a mix of both qualitative as well as quantitative goals, what we know from research methods as a mixed type of methodology. Goals tend to work well when we assign responsibility for the achievement of goals. So we know to whom to hold accountable for achieving the accomplishment of these goals. Goals work well when we empower employees to develop their own strategies and their own tactics for achieving the goals. If we merely tell people this is how you have to do, this is what you have to do, these are the tasks you have to do in achieving the goal, they're obviously going to be less motivated to do it. If they actually have the ability to participate in that, they'll be much more committed to those goals. Leaders need to be effective in terms of holding people accountable for the achievement of those goals. We need to provide feedback in terms of how well those goals are being accomplished. We need to have a feedback loop to feedback into maybe we have to modify those goals. Maybe we need to modify the tasks and activities that we have identified that will help us achieve those goals. We need to make sure that people are committed to those goals. So it's important for leaders and managers to stress the importance of those goals and how those goals are actually attainable, even if they are very difficult to achieve. And this is something that every organization needs to learn. Beware of goal overload. If you have too many goals, it's going to be a disincentive in terms of effort and motivation. You need to have a small number of very clear, agreed upon, and hopefully achievable types of goals. Yeah, I'm sure you've all heard about SMART goals. You need to make sure that your goals are very achievable and that they're very reportable. You need to have these types of SMART goals and to have a limited number of goals. So to kind of wrap this up very quickly, I know we're kind of running close to 8:30 already. So what does motivation theory look like today? We've identified for you content-based and process-based motivational theories. We've said that motivational theory is very closely associated with human resource management theory because we are understanding that different individuals are motivated by different types of incentives. And so therefore we have to understand how our individual employees are all these individual, unique human beings. But we also understand that there is no one-size-fits-all approach in motivation theory either. Today, the motivation theory literature has acknowledged that there is no one singular theory that provides a conclusive explanation of motivation. So there is no silver bullet, there is no panacea. Motivational theorists will also readily acknowledge that theory development in motivational school of theory is in a disorderly state, meaning that we cannot come up with this one universal theory, but what we can do is we can develop separate theories that apply in different types of settings. So the motivational approach that we use for one employee in one given organization may not work for another employee in that same organization, and certainly may not work for employees in other organizations. The search for these universal theories is certainly very fruitless. And so, in other words, what we're doing is we're looking for what we like to call in the literature middle range theories, theories that work in specific types of situations. So where the motivational literature has gone now is looking at the creation of taxonomies. So if we can create taxonomies, different motivational types and settings, and understand which approaches work with those types of employees and in those types of settings, we can create different taxonomies of effective motivation strategies. So in this context, in this situation, these types of content-based strategies work. In this type of situation, these types of process-oriented types of strategies work in these situations. So admittedly, the literature is relatively disjointed, but it is useful for us to understand how complex motivation is in public organizations and how it's important for us to take those human resource management theories and that recognition of the individual uniqueness of employees and use that to then understand how to motivate our employees to exert more effort to not only achieve the goals of the organization, but also to help those individual employees achieve their own individual goals. We're not really going to go into a discussion of incentives. It's just suffice to say that when we are providing these incentives in the public sector, the vast majority of the incentives tend to be intrinsic incentives. We still have a lot of those limitations on those extrinsic incentives, especially things like pay for performance. We have seen some glimmers of success with pay for performance in certain organizations and certain settings, but overall, for the most part, pay for performance has not been terribly successful in the public sector. So instead, our focus tends to be more on these intrinsic motivators, what Herzberg referred to as the motivators, as opposed to the hygiene factors. So I think that's probably in the time that we have here in this class, in this summer term, kind of a pretty good overall look at motivational theory and kind of how it dovetails and fits together with human resource management theory. So human relations theory, human resource management theory, motivational theory, these are the three theories that really kind of fit well within what we consider to be the neoclassical theories, the theories that really run counter to what we talked about with last week with classic organization theory. But our movement from the classical theory in the late 1800s now to our more modern motivational theories has really been that movement away from the one-size-fits-all approach to a much more contingency-based, contextual type of orientation. That contingency-based orientation is certainly much more appropriate for understanding our complex public organizations. The downside of it is it's more complex, and so it makes it more difficult for us to study and understand our complex public organizations, but that's the way in which we have to do organization theory today. I will stop there and ask, do you have any questions or need any clarifications on what we just talked about after the break on the School of Motivational Theory? I know a lot of this is a lot more nuanced than what you get in the Tompkins textbook. It goes beyond the Tompkins textbook, but I think it's a really good enhancement on what Tompkins talks about with human resource management theory and really does kind of help us pull us more into the way in which we study our contemporary public organizations.
Yeah, Dr. Powell, this is Karen. I just wanted to ask, yeah, was this past lecture, did a lot of it come outside of Tompkins, outside of the book?
Yes. All
Okay,
of this after the
that's
break
what I
certainly
thought.
comes from
Okay,
outside of Tompkins, right? This is
okay,
additional information from outside.
okay, thank you.
Mhm. Okay, well, I think since we're almost at 8:30, we'll go. There's obviously not time to do breakout rooms, so we'll call it quits at this point in time. I'll get this recording up onto our Canvas site by tomorrow, and then when we get together again next Tuesday for our next to last session, we will then move forward in our discussion of kind of these neoclassical theories and move into our discussion of systems theory, where instead of just looking within organizations, we're now going to start looking beyond the organization. And we're going to ask the question, how does the organization interact with its external environment? So we'll do that next week. Then we'll move into some of these other more modern theories, as I told you, organization culture, leadership theory, and kind of wrap up all of our coverage of the theories we cover here in 660 sometime in class next week. Then we'll reassess if we have some people who want to do their presentations. Then the second half of class next week, we'll do those presentations. If not, then I do have a breakout room exercise that we can do as well. And then in our final Tuesday session, we'll devote the entire session to the remainder of our presentations. Okay. Well, thanks everyone for hanging in there for all my talking for tonight. I apologize for that. Hope you have a great week, and I'll talk to you again then next Tuesday. So take care.
Have a good night.
Dr. Powell, can I
Thank
borrow you
you.
for a
Thank you,
second?
Dr. Powell.
Thank
Absolutely,
you.
sure. I will hang around. Let me stop our recording. Oops, I missed that. Okay, recording is